right, we're going to be keeping the breakfast program moving. We have an exciting 2 more speakers to bring out next. Next, we're going to have a conversation between Vilas Dhar and Marcus Brauchli. Vilas is the president and trustee of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, which is an organization advancing AI and data solutions to create an equitable and sustainable future for all. Under his leadership, the foundation bridges tech innovation and social impact with a commitment to justice and equity. He's a leading voice at the intersection of technology and social change, so we're really excited to have him here. And Marcus will be leading the conversation. Marcus is the co-founder and managing partner of North Base Media, which is a global venture firm specialized in media and tech. He was the executive director of the Washington Post from 2008 to 2012, and before that, an editor at the Wall Street Journal. We are thrilled to have them both here. So here for a fireside chat about creating digital equity, please give it up for Vilas and Marcus.
Morning, everyone. It's been a great conference. So many connections being made. Great to be here with you this morning. I think one of the things that makes an event like this so successful is it brings people together from all these adjacent areas, and with any luck, some epiphanies, some good connections ensue. There's just unlimited potential. And Vilas, you probably understand the power of possibility as well as anyone. Over the last conversations you and I have had, you've talked a bit about your personal history, how you grew up going back and forth between tech-driven US and summers in rural India. I wonder if you could maybe just start off by talking a little bit about your background, how you come to this, what the Patrick McGovern Foundation is, and what your objectives are.
Thanks so much, Marcus. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. You know, I started my career as a technologist, and I love the joy of creating new products, as so many of us do. It was fun to be able to see what we could do with computers, with phones, with the new internet as it was being developed. But I very quickly realized that building things for their own sake wasn't really the point of being a true, dignified, equitably oriented human. And I realized that we needed to do something else. Let me share with you this one thought. The fact that we're in a time of accelerating technical transformation is a cliche. You and I don't need to have a conversation about how technology is changing the world. But what I do think a lot about that we don't talk about enough is the fact that it's also a time of human transformation. That technology is changing the way we make fundamental decisions about our future, and that if we're not bringing a knowledge of technology to a conversation about social equity, then we're going to fail our future generations.
So I know you're passionate about these issues, social justice and equity, and obviously, technology can be this powerful, uplifting force. It also can create profound divisions like the so-called digital divide. Since we're in a room full of people who are focused on education, I think education is where the divide first often makes itself apparent. And I wonder how you think about how society should be teaching and introducing technology and concepts around technology, and where in the cycle that should happen.
I love that question. I'm going to start, if you don't mind, from a slightly different place. Again, I don't think that teaching technology is the point. That's not what we should be focusing on. But we live in a world where technology is becoming more intimate by the day. It knows more about us, our history, where we came from, and maybe just as importantly, predicts what we'll do next. To be a participant in that economy, we don't all have to understand how the technology works. Technology is becoming more alien. But we do have to have a shared vernacular, an ability to engage with questions about how technology is changing the world around us. So with that in mind, we often use the word digital literacy. As a foundation and as a civil society institution that thinks about these issues, we break that into 3 components. The first is, where's our social commitment to making sure that every child across the globe has access to a computer, a tablet, and connectivity to the internet? A basic sense of digital exposure that starts from day 1 of their formal schooling and is a part of their journey to becoming an educated person. If we are not doing that as a starting point, then we're failing in our fundamental promise to these children. But now that we hopefully have attained a level where everybody has an opportunity for digital exposure, then we move kind of up the value chain to what we call digital engagement. A chance to go from, I know how to use a device, to I can understand how the use of these tools fundamentally change my ability to engage with a job maybe, with a curiosity around a particular technical challenge, with the ability to understand history or psychology or sociology through these lenses. But in order to do that, we have to start with schools. And I think if we say that the idea of digital exposure is a shared responsibility for policymakers and budgeting individuals, digital engagement really sits with teachers and with superintendents. We need to make sure that curricula have components of AI education included in them. I know that an organization that you and I both know called the AI Education Project is working with school systems across the country to deploy free, well-resourced curriculum for teachers to be able to bring kids through a journey not just about what AI is, but how it affects their lives, how it fundamentally changes their view and aperture on the phenomena around them. And then finally, I'll share with you that we face a real question of equity around access to the third stage of this, digital mastery. We have heard so much about schools, digital mastery, around school systems that are particularly well-resourced, that are able to offer things like coding classes, AI camps, robotics. But we look across the spectrum of, and today we'll talk about the United States, domestic opportunity, and we see that that's quite an inequitable distribution of access. So here I think there's an incredible opportunity for civil society to step in, for nonprofits and organizations that are supporting and sustaining educational systems to do things like provide access to code camps, to bring online and real-world education around how to build a small robot. We work with groups pretty much across the spectrum, bringing indigenous kids to the Lakota Code Camp in South Dakota and North Dakota to actually train on how we identify native species that are particularly held in indigenous communities and have kind of deep knowledge about how they can be used. We work with groups like the Hidden Genius Project, working out of Oakland to inspire young black men to pursue technology careers. Groups like AI for All that are bringing young women into AI education camps. You know, these three aspects, digital engagement, digital exposure, digital engagement, digital mastery, together make up the idea of what digital literacy could look like, and put the agency to make choices about what kids are exposed to, certainly with teachers and superintendents, but also with the kids themselves, so they can make choices about exactly how they want to pursue this path.
So I wonder if you see, is there any tension between the goals you're describing on equity and making sure every kid has a chance to understand this stuff, and sort of national economic competitiveness questions that often come up when we're talking about technology in terms of like how the economy, how people who drive the economy think we should be teaching technology and who should be learning what?
Well, let's start first from intention, right? I think we need a moment of political will, where we acknowledge the idea that bridging the digital divide isn't a conversation we need to be having anymore. We know there is a digital divide. We know in many ways how to address it, and what it now requires is political will to drive resources into communities and let them take on their own journey to getting to connectivity, to being digitally exposed. But the second part of it then is to say competitiveness, you know, there's plenty of data out there that shows that there are countries in the world today that are exceeding the US's capabilities at a labor and workforce level to engage with jobs of the future. And if this doesn't become a primary part of a national domestic agenda over the next 5 years, I think we lose our ability to influence this for the next 20.
So one area that I think is interesting and often overlooked in the conversation, because we were just talking about, or you were talking about hardware and kids getting exposure to tablets and computers, and is data. And data is like, capital was the dividing line in the past. Data could become a dividing line in the future, and data can play lots of different ways. I mean, obviously in the globally competitive space, there's the question of, I've heard people talk a lot about whether China is more flexible, shall we say, in allowing the collection of data and the use of data, which has immense power for AI, than the US and certainly than Europe, where there's a lot more concern about privacy. Do you see in this conversation about equity and justice, is there a way in which data plays into that as well?
Absolutely it does, and again, let's start from the basics. What is data? So much of the world has become a conversation about who owns it, who controls it, who shapes it, and who transmits it. But much more fundamentally, data is an extension of our personal identities in a digital world. And until we center the human in the conversation, the individual agency and sovereignty that comes from my data being used by you, we've got a totally different conversation going on. I think particularly in the context of education, we see this incredible power dynamic, right? And a differentiation between a student who's often a recipient of education, right? In many of the ways that traditional curricula are designed, but are now becoming products of a data ecosystem for the private sector, that are now thinking about how we shape from behavioral patterns and from engagement, how we shape how they'll be assessed, evaluated, and brought into the workforce. And that's a critical issue that we have to engage with.
I mean, there's a hazard there, right? I mean, this conversation, you and I actually were talking yesterday about how you can use AI to define somebody, and that definition can stick with them forever. And how should we think about that within the framework, just to bring it back to education, how should we think about that within the framework of education to ensure that, you know, if at some point in a kid's life spectrum they register a certain way, the AI defines them a certain way, that doesn't become that definition for them forever?
Mm-hmm. So you're asking a critical question that we think about all the time. I'm not a techno-optimist. I don't think that technology solves all problems. But in the question you've just asked, there's actually an incredible technological answer, which is the development of long-term life records, these LERs, learning and employment records, that actually allow people to go out and go through an educational system and acquire an educational credential, go to third-party providers and get credentials around skill sets, to build a career that's a pathway driven by their experiences, and in doing so, create a way to represent themselves to employers and to economic opportunity in a meaningful way. But just because we can do that doesn't mean that we don't have to spend a lot of time now architecting a mechanism by which the agency to create and own a record like that is owned by the individual. That people have the opportunity to opt out, that people have the opportunity to say, I'm willing to participate, but only in limited ways. And most importantly, that I only give consent to use these records about me in a way that is beneficial for my interests. When we come to every single one of these questions, and one of the reasons that I am here as a representative of civil society is to say we could probably solve most of the questions that we asked today about how technology might harm us. We could probably come up with a solution. We could come up with a governance, a human framework, a way to structure the tool in a way that centers, again, equity. But in order to do so, we have to make choices about it. And the time to make those choices is now. If we think about the conversation around these tools, particularly AI 5 years ago, we were still in a speculative mode. We were saying, I think we have a sense of what opportunities and threats might be presented. I worry that in 5 years, we'll be in a world where we say, you know, 5 years ago, the work was happening, and we had a chance to make some decisions. And in those decisions, to center some human principles and values, and we didn't do it. So the time is now, and there's an urgency to this conversation.
And how do you rate our chances? I mean, actually, on your website, I noticed you guys talk about you're optimists, it says,
yeah.
You know, and you're change makers. So how optimistic are you that these kinds of changes in a politically polarized environment we live in today can get made?
Yeah, I'll tell you two things. I mean, one is you mentioned at the top of this conversation, I split a lot of my childhood between the US living very close to a national center for supercomputing and the rest of its summers in rural India. I had a chance to go back to many of the villages that I spent time in as a child a couple of years ago. I talked to some farmers, and as one does when you talk to a farmer, I'm from rural Illinois, I asked the farmer, you know, tell me about the harvest. Tell me what you're expecting. When I was a kid, the answer was, we just did a ceremony, we prayed, and we're really hoping that we'll get a good harvest this year. But a couple of years ago, I got a totally different response. The farmer pulled out a phone, and he showed me the app on his phone that showed him the expected weather patterns, the expected economic pricing of the rice that he might be able to grow, the best date to harvest, not just for access to the market, but also with a tweak and a push of a button, when to best harvest it to reduce his carbon emissions. I'm an incredible optimist about what technology will let us do. And I see even today, folks who are mechanics using augmented systems to go and work on cars, the ability to find jobs that you might never have access because of this technology. So I'm a deep optimist, but I'm also a realist. And the realism comes from the fact that this is not a political issue, but it is an issue of political will. There should be no difference, there should be no partisan kind of thinking about this. At the end of the day, if we want to protect human welfare in a digital age, the things that we should be prioritizing are pretty universal characteristics. We should be prioritizing individual interests and dignity. We should be prioritizing the fact that nobody wants to be surveilled. We should be prioritizing the fact that if there's a market to be created between employers and labor, between governments and citizens, building a structure that actually allows for shared interests is going to be more sustainable for the long term than anything else. The problem is we have to make those decisions and we have to step into them as an informed populace.
Vilas, thank you very much for this. I think your optimism, I can't say I fully share your optimism that something will get done the right way. I think there's a bit of dystopianism right now that is real, but it's great that you're out there doing this work, and I wish you all success in it, and thanks for being here this morning.
Thanks so much, Marcus, and thank you all. Appreciate it.